Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of PD and PDubs Unscripted, and for Wednesday, September 27th. And if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see that there is a third person here on the podcast. So good to be with PDubs here, and we got Joe joining us today. Joe, great to have you with us.
Hi everybody, thanks for having me, you guys.
Yeah, so PDubs, good to see you again.
Great to be with you guys. Joe, thanks for coming into the studio today, and just to get to know you a little bit more. And as Joe has stepped in to take over leading our praise team and really coming with some fresh ideas for our praise team worship and stuff like that. So, and you're an alum of Immanuel, so it's not like you're new at all to us.
Yeah, so I grew up coming to the church from a young age, and then I didn't come to school here until junior high, so I was only here for 7th and 8th, but still makes me alum, right? So, and funny enough, that's where here is where I first got my biggest dose of live playing. So at that time, when we were doing chapel on Wednesdays, teacher, Mr. Kirchhoff at the time, played acoustic guitar and sang, and
nice.
He came up to me, I think it was like my second day at school, and was like, Mr. Latuszek, anyone who knew Mr. Kirchhoff, arms folded, Mr. Latuszek, so I hear that you play drums, and so that began my playing experience. I mean, I had played in bands and stuff, but it was really cool to have basically a full crowd every Wednesday.
Yeah.
And it was great musician training. It was a lot of, what we'd call, garage band endings, which is like, Mr. Kirchhoff kind of shooting me a look, like, we're ending now, So little did I know those were giving me a lot of tools and skills that I would be using today. So it's kind of a full circle thing to be.
That's so cool.
Be doing the worship leader position, and I'm so thankful that you guys consider me for it, and I'm happy to be helping. So.
Yeah.
Real quick before you do you want to adjust your camera just a little bit?
Oh, sure.
Because when you're kind of facing towards where PDubs is, you kind of see the core of your face is missing.
Well, I may have to do this like 7 more times. We'll see. Sorry, guys.
No, it's all good. It's like I said, this is a learning for us. We've never had 3 guests with the video aspect of the podcast.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Hey, we're breaking new ground here. That's
and that was always our first, like when we first did the pastor was like, where do I look when we're recording? Do I look at you or do I look at the screen?
Yeah. It's like, how close do I want to be to the mic?
Right.
And, all that stuff.
So we're still playing around with this whole video aspect of the podcast. But yeah, so it's great, man. I feel outnumbered here with the alumni of Palatine, the Immanuel Bobcats here.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great school and a great program. And so I'm so happy that my son is here now. And so that's kind of how I got back into the church here. So we lived up north for a little while. We were in Wonder Lake and then Island Lake. And so that kind of got us away from Immanuel for a bit. And then when we came back to Palatine, my wife and I own a dance and music company. And so we decided to homeschool Brad for a while. And I just wasn't happy with a lot of the options that were available for schools and stuff. And we kind of had a different teaching philosophy we wanted to try with Brad. And it just became obvious around 3rd, 4th grade that he needed more than what we could give him in homeschool. So we had tried a couple of, one kind of alternative school, and it just was not what we thought it would be. And so COVID happened, and things were getting crazy, and we were like, where do we want to send Brad? And I turned to my wife, and I was like, I think we should really consider Immanuel. I went there for a couple of years, and it's been a while since we've been back in church, and so it's been a blessing because getting him back in school has slowly led us back to the church, and so he started in 5th grade here, and he's in 7th grade this year. So this is like our 3rd year back at the church, and it's just each year we've gotten a little bit more involved, and now it seems like it's it's kind of culminated now in me in leading the worship band. So it's been great to be back. It's I'd like to call it a happy accident, but I think I was led here by God. I believe that.
I was just thinking of that. Like, you must look back and see God's fingerprints in your journey, from what you just described, being in another town and then coming into Palatine and then trying to homeschool, and then COVID happens. And then, getting reconnected to Immanuel is, it's kind of cool when you really see God working through that. And it's like confirming in your heart, like, this is a good thing.
Yeah, I definitely feel led here that way. I mean, I was volunteering with the worship band off and on in my late teens and early 20s, and I frankly I had a crisis of faith. I think a lot of young people around that age do too. I was struggling a lot with. I had intellectual curiosities I was sort of almost demanding logical answers that I didn't have. I don't know if you remember, Pastor Warren. I came and visited you. I think I was 19 or 20. And I asked for your guidance in this, and I remember that. Throughout the course of our conversation, at some point you said, I may not be able to answer every one of your specific theological questions, but what I can point you to is to prayer and to turning within and to that element of the Holy Spirit within you that we connect to through prayer. And yeah, it was a long, most of my 20s I spent kind of wandering around. I read a lot of philosophy and was just searching for answers. And it's just interesting to see how far away from God and Christ I felt at that time in my life, and how much closer I feel now. I could have never predicted that 10, 15 years ago that I would be back in the church. And yeah, frankly, I feel much more centered in my faith today than I have in a long time.
That's awesome.
So it's been just a tremendous blessing to be back and be working with the team. And so yeah, I'm just happy to be here.
Yeah, because when you're talking about coming back, I said, I was thinking like when I got to know you a little bit better is when you, your wife, your brother, and now sister-in-law chaperoned the confirmation retreat last year up at Lake Geneva.
That was fun. That was a real blast. And, I come from a big family. I come from one of 6 kids. And so, I heard you guys needed some more chaperones. It started with me and Jamie, and then you need a couple more. So I asked my brother and my sister-in-law, and it was funny for my son Brad because he's like trying to get some independence away from mom and dad, and here he is with his
bringing the whole
and
family
uncle and mom and dad.
Yeah.
So we pulled back this year and let him have some space. We're like, we won't volunteer this year, buddy. I understand.
But
that was a great weekend. And it was so fun to spend time with you and get to know everyone more. And
I always look forward to that week, as all the stress leading up to it of like, okay, is this taken care of? This taken care of? And then once you get there, it's like all that stuff, it all fell into place.
Yeah, all those moving parts. I don't know about you, but a lot of times it feels like when there's so many moving parts, it's like at some point it's like, this isn't going to work. It just feels like there's no way this is going to work, And then when it does, it's like, great. That's a little bit how worship music feels too. It's like you're rehearsing all week. You start rehearsing and you go, this is not going to work. And it's no one person's thing. It's just the nature of the beast sort of thing.
Right.
And then there's always that sense of relief when it's like, okay, things are falling together. We've got these songs on lock, and so I bet there's a lot of work that goes into preparing for that weekend.
Or even like a sermon or a message. Like there's times when you're like, I don't know, is this gonna all connect?
I know.
And then once you're up there, it's just like, okay, just going with the flow.
Yep. It's just like you're begging to God, okay, order my thoughts, make it make sense sometimes, and he does his thing, and if we're willing and our hearts are open to be used by him, things come together.
I've always been curious about that too, just from like a purely like a public speaking perspective. Is like how much time do you have to spend on a sermon? Do you have sort of ideas in mind that you want to hit? Like how does that how does that process work for you guys? Is it different for everyone?
I think it's different. I mean, I'll let you share your process and I can share mine.
Yeah, I mean, always kind of just like a week ahead of time looking at the text and, getting refamiliarized with typically the gospel, but our lectionary system kind of ties Old Testament, New Testament, and gospel together. So there's some common themes.
Oh, cool.
So you try and lift out some of those like a week ahead of time. And then, unfortunately, in my role, I probably don't spend as much time as I'd like to up front, that I find myself kind of like, okay, it's getting to the end of the week. I got to really dedicate some time away, get in the Word again, generate some ideas. I'll listen to other resources on podcasts, or I'll look up various written commentaries on the matter. And but what I like to do is like through the week, I've learned how God shows you some like real-time things that are happening in real life that are relatable. So that could maybe be a part of the shaping of the message.
Yeah.
And, if appropriate, a good sermon illustration or something like that. But it's a lot of like, okay, Lord, I've got a million thoughts going on here. I need you to order them for me.
Yes.
And it is that final, for me anyway, that final day before, sometimes morning of, day of, afternoon of, I'm just like, okay, I've got a lot of thoughts. If I can get a lead point going, then I'm off and running, kind of like a launching platform. And then it seems like God brings it all together, for me. So that's me. And you're right. We're all made differently.
Right.
We all think differently. We all like come with ideas and thought pockets, differently, and order our thoughts differently. So that's kind of how I've come to do it. I'm more of a thought bubble thinker, and I'll pull some things down and pray that they kind of make sense and have an order. But we've been really trying to preach from the gospel more so, and like take people through God's word, and so that kind of helps order me,
Right.
Yeah, it gives you some kind of guideline of what you're aiming at, and helps structure it.
Right. And I think some of that is connected to with our last pastors conference we went to up at Lake Delavan. It was on preaching, and they kind of talked about that, like where, to kind of keep that consistency in people's minds, like reflect back or point back to like a previous message and say like, hey, we just read this, last week, and this is where it's following up kind of in the story. So people see that it all continues.
That's interesting. In stand-up comedy, they call that a callback. I'm a big fan of stand-up.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think callbacks are, it gives that sense of continuity and wholeness. And I'm always just curious about public speaking type stuff in general, because it's like this fine balance of, how much planning should you do and how much should be speaking sort of extemporaneously. And so, because you'll see some public speakers that they're so organized it's dry.
Yeah.
And then you'll see others that have not clearly done enough preparation work, And so it's like, I'm always fascinated by the question of how much structure versus, free-flowing improvisation sort of being inspired by God.
Yeah, I'd say he's a little more free-flowing than me. Like my process, a little bit similar to his, like, week and a half before I look at the text and be like, okay, start thinking of ideas of what I want to talk about. And then it usually seems to be like when I can't sleep at night, I'm like, okay, start going through my mind, like thinking about what I could do and like maybe something, how to connect it to some illustration.
Yeah.
And then recently, Concordia Seminary St. Louis, where I attended, two of the professors there started a podcast where they take like the readings for that weekend and they say, if I was preaching, here's some ideas I would kind of use. And so I've kind of used that as a little guideline of like, hey, that's some good points that I didn't think about.
Sure.
Same with him using commentaries. And then I try to usually write mine, kind of like him. I'd rather do it sooner than I get around to it, but mine usually is like Friday morning, my day off, or when I can't sleep at night. Like this last one, I came back from new members class. I'm like, I'm going to do the sermon when I get home, so that way I don't have to do it Friday. And then I was like, I'm too tired. It's been a long day. I can't think. And then it was like, I watched the Thursday night football game. I'm about to go to my bed to watch TV, go to bed. I was like, it's 10. I can't sleep. I'm just going to go write my sermon. I know what I'm going to think about. And that's the thing. I think about the ideas with putting pen to paper, and I'll use the notes app a lot on my iPad and like handwrite some notes in there and like kind of map out ideas.
Do you find that often that in the evenings is when inspiration strikes?
Depends. Like I think just when I can't sleep and I'm like, sometimes it helps me fall asleep because then I'm like thinking instead of like wandering 50 billion different topics, I'm just thinking about that one.
Yes.
And then it's like, okay, I hope I remember this in the morning when I wake up.
Yeah.
But that's usually my process. And even practicing, like I've changed how that, because I think I used to like say it more times practicing in advance.
Sure.
But then I think that got too robotic and letting that free flowing.
Yeah, again, it's that fine line, right, between the mechanic and the free flowing kind of thing. And inspiration is a funny thing too, because as a musician, we deal with that kind of thing all the time, and I think a lot of creative types will sort of wait for inspiration to strike, and I think there's a time for that. But I think there's ways that you can invite inspiration, and it's interesting. The reason I asked the question about if it happens in the middle of the night for you a lot is I find that a lot of times when the mind is still and someone's really and it could just be having a moment out in nature, and I think we've all had that experience of a beautiful sunset or a tree or a breeze or just something sort of just almost stuns the mind enough to just stop for a moment. And I find that in that little gap where you're not thinking, that's often where it's like God or the Holy Spirit, that inspiration sort of floods in. And so I spend maybe an inordinate amount of time, doing things that help facilitate that kind of inspirational space. I like the idea of one conscious breath, which is just taking all of your attention as much as you can muster and focusing it all on the sensation of one full breath, the physical sensation, the sound, all of it. And it's like this little mini prayer. It's like a little mini meditation that just sort of aligns everything. And I've often found that just practicing that throughout the day, injecting that intentional little bit of space helps facilitate the kind of inspiration we're talking about, whether it's speaking or music or whatever. You know?
Or it's one of those, something happens like he was saying that you're like, oh, that would be a good illustration. And I appreciate you talking about stand-up comedians because I think I've heard a pastor talk about like watching stand-up comedians and just see how smoothly they transition from one topic to the next.
Yes.
Where it's like, how do they do that so perfectly?
Yeah, I think, there is definitely an art to it, and they've got an act and a routine, but, it's like, I've watched a lot of podcasts and interviews with comedians, and, like you guys, processes vary, right? But I think very often it's a similar idea. You start with an idea or a theme, and then that gets connected to a few others, and then you build a chunk, and then 3 chunks make a section, and then 3 sections make an hour-long special, And so, they've got a whole year to put together a special.
Yeah.
You guys have 1 week. I mean, obviously, I'm sorry to use the comparison. You guys aren't doing a comedy special. But and I do appreciate that about your preaching too, is that there is a lightheartedness and a fellowship between you two that I think are Immanuel's needed for a long time, and so it's really nice just seeing it. There's a lightness there that I think we all appreciate. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we enjoy working together.
For sure. And, I appreciate your kind of relating, your methods and what inspires, inspiration or clear thought. Because, there are times where if I'm walking, I've learned that if I'm walking, I have more thoughts coming through. And so if I'm walking in nature, which 2 things, I like to do, then I see that God helps me order my thoughts through those things.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I'm blessed with a wife who sometimes asks me, "Oh, what are you preaching on this week?" And I'll show her I'll say, "Oh, it's this." She goes, "No, I know the title, but what are you talking about?" So what she's doing is she's trying to draw it out of me so I can like put some thoughts to hear myself. So that's the other part of it, is like to hear yourself kind of talk it out, and then to me that solidifies in my mind those start points, those
it like
transitions.
Forces you to think at a higher resolution when someone is asking you questions.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I don't know about you, but I'm very like I can't like start on a middle part of the sermon. I have to kind of write it in an order.
Yeah, me too.
Like once in a while I might think I don't know what I'm going to start. Like, 'cause I usually like to use some sort of illustration or story. But I'm like, sometimes I'm like, I just need to get that right order, that I can't just jump around. Like, you think of like how movies are filmed. It's not filmed in order. They film random scenes.
Right.
I couldn't do that for writing a sermon. Like,
you gotta go chronological for it to make sense.
And even sometimes, I'll make a little outline. Like, I kind of joke that I'm like, my least favorite thing almost is coming up with a sermon title, because I never know by the time what I'm going to maybe talk about. And then I preach, I'm like, that had nothing to do with the sermon title.
That had nothing to do with it.
Or we try to, I know you've done a little bit, and I try to do from time to time, is like make some pop culture reference, whether it's song title or like a movie reference, and see if anybody catches on to it.
Yeah, it's a great tie-in. Yeah, and it's like, just with same thing with musicians and stand-up comedians, there's a rhythm to the whole thing. And so finding your rhythm, I imagine, takes some time. And one thing I have a lot of respect for too is this is just the way my brain works, but it doesn't matter if I've been in class or doing a public speaking project or whatever. I'll use all of the tools they give me, like, make note cards, Joe, so you can remember your points. But I don't know about you. The second I switch my focus to reading something, it's like, it takes me out of it like that, So, I'm curious how, like, when you're talking about ordering your thoughts, like, how do you kind of hop from topic to topic? Is that something that you just kind of lay out and then reference in notes, or is that part of the preparatory work for sort of imagining the rhythm and how you want this story to unfold? Is it both?
I would say it's more of the preparatory and a little bit of sometimes in the moment, because I think, like, if you were asked, Pastor, as well, and maybe our elders, they see us preach all 3 services. And I think you'll find some common theme from the first service to the last. But as it kind of, like, I'll just say, evolves through the weekend, maybe there'll be an injection of something that, the Lord kind of prompted us on one service or another. And so there's a little of that in there. And, like, trying to, well, like, who's your audience? Sometimes one service over another might provide a different way to present in some ways.
Yeah, so, sure.
Yeah,
it's
that's
just keeping
cool.
those things in mind.
Right, and I think
Yeah.
for me, the personal stories might change a little bit. Like this past weekend, talking about my time at Jewel, that was never exactly the same each time. The same kind of theme was there each time.
Yeah.
But the way I worded, because I know you were talking about it on Gathering Place last night when I said, oh, I was in my checking prime.
Yeah.
I think I only said that at one service.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's that, and like I tend to have my full manuscript up there with me. But some of the things I do, so I'm not always relying on there. If there's something specifically I want to read, like a quote or something, I'll highlight that or put that in red font so I can quickly look down and know exactly where on the page that is and not have to be like, oh, where is it in that paragraph? And I think that's also why I resort more to having my Bible up there and reading from there instead of in my manuscript, the Bible quote.
Yeah. Sure.
And I have those notes usually like highlighted or underlined so I can find it quickly on that page.
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, I'm very fascinated by just sort of how the sausage is made, so to speak, and,
Yeah.
sort of with everything. But it's different for us in music in that. Well, it really depends on the context, right? Because worship music is different than if we're up there improvising, playing jazz or something. Those are different musical goals. But for us, for the worship team, it's almost exclusively preparation, right? We have to know the song form and be familiar with the song enough. And for me, especially because I'm new to a lot of worship music, every week is like 3 new songs for me. So for the more experienced members that have been around and listening to worship music for a long time, they might already be familiar with the song form, which helps a lot. But and I'm always telling my students this too in my teaching practice. But for us, it's not just like brute force repetition and remembering stuff. That's part of practice, but the other half of practice is, for musicians at least, is recall. So, imagine if I give you, you're taking drum lessons from me, and I give you a rhythmic concept to practice. If you sit down and practice that for 20 minutes, maybe you got a ton of repetitions on it, but you've only recalled the information once. And so how you practice actually has a lot to do with how you retain stuff. So for me, the 3 songs, when I'm working on them daily, I play each song twice. I make my chart notes and all that stuff. But midway through the week, instead of playing each song twice, I will play each song once, like as a set, back to back, and then play the set again. And what that forces me to do is, instead of having played the song twice and only recalled it once, I've had to recall each song now twice. I don't know if that's making sense. The way
I
I'm saying
totally
that.
get that. Yeah.
And so that recall, because part of what we're doing is we're built. It's the same thing with language. We have sort of an index that we need to reach into our minds and pull out to say the things that we want to say, and so it is too musically. And so, a lot of that practice is not, again, just the repetition. It's being able to switch from one thought to the next in real time. And so you need that ability to sort of, I call it like CPU. It's like you need enough CPU to be able to make those changes in real time. And that's really how you learn song forms. And so it's just funny that the actual method of practice will yield different results.
Right.
You could have 2 musicians that spend the exact same amount of time on rehearsing songs, but if one has more recall than the other, almost 10 out of 10 times they will have a better understanding of the song form and how to execute it.
Well, it almost reminds me, and I don't know if you've ever done this, PDubs, but like, sometimes when we run out of the communion elements, especially when it's the wine, and you have to bring that out, and we have to bless that because it wasn't out in the initial, I'm always like, how does this go again? Because I'm used to that like order of doing the words of institution, starting with the host and blessing the wafer or the bread, and then to get into like the wine, I was like,
you have to take a second.
I had to take it that second to almost like go through the other part of my head to recall like, what's the order?
Yeah.
So at least I'm not the only one that's like, what is it again?
Yeah, for sure. We understand a lot of information in reference to other pieces of information. So when it exists in an isolated way, it's like, what?
Yeah.
What is that? Yeah.
Drawing that blank.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, that's where I really appreciate a lot of what you're giving, and I have 2 thoughts. The one is I've dabbled in guitar, okay, and I remember my teacher.
Why are we going to get you on stage?
Oh, because I've been way too far removed from it. So I've
yeah.
put the guitar down many a years, but
It's time to pick it back up.
I know when I first got here at Immanuel, I had a pastor teaching me actually beforehand, and then I had someone else teaching me. Like we would meet almost weekly, and I remember like playing the chords, and I'd be like, and you're a beginner, you're always looking at like your fingers where you're putting them on the fret, and the teacher would go, all right, now I want you to look up and not look at your fingers and read your chord chart. Okay. And so there's that, okay, we're going deeper in my mind of trying to crystallize how to play.
Yes.
So then it's like, okay, now I can actually play just looking at my chords. And then he's like, okay, now I want you to play without looking at the sheet at all, but play the song to memory and don't look at yourself. And so where he was getting me to was standing in front of people and playing.
Yes.
I mean, it's one thing if you're a part of the band. This is what I learned, and you're kind of in the background. You can kind of maybe get away with not having to look up. But if now all of a sudden you're the worship leader, now is like, okay, now I want you to sing the song while you're playing.
Yes.
And so I'd be like doing this, and he's like, no, don't look down, don't look there. Now, okay, now that you got the words down and you're already doing good with the strumming, look up, and now you got all three of the things.
Yes.
And I thought, man, this is such an expansion on the mind. Because your mind gets tired because you're trying to remember all these things.
It's like a completely different type of fatigue.
Yeah,
right?
it is.
Yeah, and I think for people who don't practice music, it can kind of be hard to understand what that is. And with my students, I call that the triangle of confusion, because it's like right hand, left hand chart, right hand, left hand chart. And so I work on similar stuff with my students, which is just getting comfortable enough to be able to reach for the chord without having to look at it and stuff like that. And I remember when I first started playing, it was just all but a mystery to me that anyone could play the guitar and sing at the same time.
I know.
I was really into Dave Matthews. Who wasn't in the 90s? But but Dave is from South Africa, and a lot of African rhythms, they're unique to Western rhythms. And a lot of African rhythms, they won't even, in a lot of Western rhythms, we have a strong pulse on one. And as long as you can hit one, you're good, you know? And so if things are kind of floating around, come back to one. In a lot of African music, that's not the case. The one is often silent or ignored. And so Dave brought this really interesting approach to playing and singing guitar. And anyone who has studied singing or playing guitar knows that it's notoriously difficult to play a Dave song and sing it, because he's doing stuff that most traditional singer-songwriters are not. And that for me was one of those sort of huge expansion moments that you're talking about, where you're just kind of connecting dots and going, wow, there's a whole deeper level to this game than I was even aware of.
Yep.
And then you add to him the improv that they do when they're live.
Yeah.
That they don't stick it to just how it is on the CD.
Yeah. And improvisation, is an interesting topic in music in general, but it's sort of like, if either of you like cooking, it's a similar thing. It's like, okay, I made chicken for my family this last week. There's 100 different ways to prepare chicken. I understand enough about seasoning and cooking to give you something that's going to taste good. And my wife was like, how did you make this? And it's like, well, it's like, if you can broadly understand the principles of cooking, you can improvise a little bit. Right. And so it's the same thing. Like we've got a song form that we've got to stick to, and that's where I have a lot of freedom on the drums, and that's where I can be a little bit selfish, because I probably should play some more guitar and bass for the worship band, but I'm like, I want to play drums. Part of it though is I get more of that creative kind of freedom. I know the parts I got to hit and where they have to be hit, but within that, there's a lot of room to play around with where I'm placing the kick drum or the snare drum or what I'm doing with whatever beat, and so I like that. I like that ability to, here's the structure, but we can play within it. I like that, and that's what prompted my question about the speaking frequency, because I suspected it was something like that there's a structure, but we have to learn how to play within that structure, because if I have found that people are about as comfortable with you as you are with them, and so I've seen nervous speakers, and it makes you nervous, and so I'm just always curious how to feel comfortable in your position, where you have a fresh new message every week. It's not like you've had weeks and weeks and weeks to memorize everything, and to feel at ease communicating. And you've mentioned this phrase a few times, ordering your thoughts. I find that tremendously difficult. I will have a million thoughts, and then finding which ones to follow, and then which ones should follow within that whole, pool of possibilities is just, that's a whole... It's a whole nother world,
Let me ask you this, because sometimes we get asked this, at least I think I do, I don't know about you, is have you ever played a song or performed in someone and you think, oh, that was rough. Whew. I didn't feel good going in. I didn't feel confident going in.
Yeah.
And so you're pressing through, and while you're going through, you're feeling a little, you're feeling kind of the emotion of oh, this is not good. And then you push through it. And then, you're thinking, well, I got through it, right?
Yeah.
And then somebody comes and says, That was awesome.
Dude, that was the greatest message I've
I
heard
know,
this month.
yeah. And you're like, huh?
What?
Yeah, see, I get-
What?
Yeah,
Do you
yeah,
get
yeah.
that in music?
Yes,
Like,
yes. And I tell my students too, it's like I call it hiding your crimes, you know?
Yeah.
It's like you miss a note, you flub a word
Mm-hmm.
or something, you know? And so in music, there's kind of, you know, as you get more advanced, there's kind of sophisticated ways you might hide your crimes, you know? But yeah, I have found that often where I will do like a drum take on something. So over COVID, when we were all sort of going, I know I was going crazy. I had committed to writing, filming, and making a new music video every day for 100 days. And so every day I wrote a guitar part, a bass part, a synth part, a drum part, and then I would have kind of like slides over it with some kind of like spiritual message. And so I drove myself nuts doing that for 100 days. But what I found is that very frequently that would be the case. I'd be on take 10 of something going like, man, I just cannot get this today. And then through sheer exhaustion, I'd kind of give up for a minute. And then you're going through your library of the things you've recorded and you go, well, heck, take one actually was the best.
Was all right,
And
yeah.
I thought take one was awful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a weird thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that is. I'm going to say it's like maybe divine guidance from God or
Yeah.
something.
'Cause I
It's
always
like,
Yeah, go
feel
ahead.
like it's like sermons like, I don't know, is this a good one? And people will be like, oh, that was a great sermon.
Yeah.
And then times I'm like, oh, this one's going to be really speak to him. And then nobody says a
It's
word.
crickets. Yeah.
know,
That
like-
was the other side I was going to
Yeah.
come at.
And
So
I
I'm
also
glad you
think
brought
it
that
too,
up.
like, I remember saying this a lot in my vicarage, my internship down in Oklahoma. Like, I'd preach. We had a couple different services on Sunday. I'd preach. Okay, people laughed at the 8 o'clock service at what I said. Okay, I'm going to say the same thing at the next service. And nobody
And
laughed.
nothing.
And it's just
Yeah,
like,
crickets.
it's like, oh, I was anticipating a laugh there.
That's
or,
rough.
or a reaction. And then, or you had the reverse where nobody responded the first time. And then the second time, it's like, I just can't get it.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, being here now 7 years, going on 8, like I kind of know the personalities of the services and
Yes.
what to expect a little bit more. But every once in a while, they throw you off or change it up on you.
and I'm curious too how much sometimes that's, you know, just a different audience, and how much sometimes that is just in the moment, sort of divine inspiration. The thing occurred to you, you said it, it got a laugh.
Yeah.
And then the mind goes, I'm going to remember that. I'm going to get a laugh
Yeah,
next time.
right.
And then when you say it, it doesn't have the same energy the second time because it wasn't inspired.
Right.
And maybe that has something to do with why people didn't respond to it with laughter.
could
You know,
be.
I'm curious where that sort of line is, you know?
Right.
But yeah, I'm, you know, when I go for a joke and it flubs, I just like the old, is this thing on? You know, you save yourself with that.
Yeah, I remember growing up here at Immanuel, I played trombone, and you know it was always practice. You got to practice. You got to
Yeah,
practice, and you know, being a teacher, you've kind of talked about like different things, like you create time for creativity, but there is this discipline to
Yes.
playing an instrument, and
Yes.
it is a craft, but it's also a discipline, right? And
Yes, yes.
and that's how you kind of lift in your abilities.
Right. And so I think there's this, you know, mistake of thinking that, you know, well, we're all born with gifts that God gives us. And so it's easy for someone to go like, you're so talented. And that's a sweet gesture, but you know, talent gets your foot in the door, you know, but at some point it is about disciplined action. You know, I mean,
Right.
you know, Michael Jordan may have had some physical talent that maybe some of his peers lacked, but he didn't get to be number one. I'm sorry, he's number one. I know the
No
young kids,
arguments.
it's LeBron, but
No arguments here.
No arguments here.
but he didn't get to be number one by just hanging out on talent. You know, that was a disciplined regimen of balling every day, of practicing every possible type of shot and configuration. And so, you know, I tell my students this, but you don't have to practice a ton every day, but you should aim for everydayness because it does two things. You can't make an excuse if it's just something you do every day. You brush your teeth every day, you just do it every day. So if you can just get in that mindset of like, I practice my trombone every day. But, you know, also start small. You know, I tell my students, I like to ask my students, how do you eat a whale? And the answer is one bite at a
One
time.
at a time, yeah.
One bite at a time. And so, you know, and I think we were talking about this in our last meeting. There's no telling what the upper limit is of incremental progression across time. You know, 0.5%, 1% a day or weekly. The other thing is that compounds, you know, and so yeah, there's a discipline aspect. I study and play drums like 4 hours every day, and I've really only been able to do that since COVID. My wife going back to school, and our home positions have kind of changed, so I've had more time to do it, which has also made me available to help with this. But yeah, I mean, I study 4 hours a day, and students will ask like, how do you study, you know, drums every day for 10 years? And it's like, well, it's there's a parallel here with music and sort of and studying the Bible. I mean, you can study the Bible the rest of your life, and you will never run. You know, me and my son were talking at dinner last night. We were playing the game of like you're stranded on a desert island. You get one book, one TV show, one movie, what it is. And you know, when we were thinking about books, I said it would have to be the Bible. It's the only book that I could read for the rest of my life and still be learning. You know, and so music is similar in that way, as you can study forever, and there's no real mastering your instrument. You know, you open that guitar case and there it is, looking at you, kind of laughing. You know, it's like, check me out, buddy. And so, yeah, that discipline aspect is very real. And I think for creative people, it's easy to overlook that because there's a lot of the element of what we're talking about, divine inspiration. Things will just sort of appear to you fully formed. And but then it's up to us, I think, to cultivate that. You know, that was a gift that was given to you fully formed.
Yeah.
And so I think we actually have some kind of responsibility to developing the gifts that we're given. You know, I would argue that's actually a moral thing, that you're responsible for developing the gifts that you've been given. You know,
it's a great way to think about it.
Yeah. And there's this question of like, do we double down on our weaknesses or double down on our strengths? I don't think it's an either-or question. I think it's a bit of both. But you know, what I tell my students is find the thing that you're naturally good at that you can develop. You know, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I got a D in physics and I want to study really hard. But that doesn't mean that you should necessarily be a physicist, right?
Yeah.
The world doesn't need a C+ physicist.
Right.
You know? So if your thing is whatever, earth science, and that's your thing, then maybe that's the thing you develop as well. So I'm always fascinated by that question of like, which is it? Do you develop a strength or develop a weakness? I think it's both, but I also kind of believe that we're tilted, we're oriented towards our gifts, and so maybe that's the thing to really invest in.
And it's funny because you were talking. I was just starting to read the book Atomic Habits, and they're talking about that like 1% better every day, like do something 1%. And this is statistics they had in here, and there's one other thing, and I was trying to find on the Kindle app on my phone. They said if you're 1% worse every day for 1 year, that equals 0.03, like that you're getting improving or getting worse. But he's like, if you're 1% better every day for 1 year, so that's 1.01 times to 365, that's 37.78% better you're going to be.
Right.
In a year. And then he used this like example about like flying, which was interesting about how one little change, he said, the impact created by a change in your habits is similar to the effect of shifting the route of an airplane by just a few degrees.
Right.
Imagine you're flying from Los Angeles to New York City. If a pilot is leaving from LAX and adjusts the heading just 3.5 degrees south, you will land in Washington, D.C. instead of New York. Such a small change is very noticeable at takeoff. The nose of the airplane just moves a few feet, but when magnified across the entire United States, you end up hundreds of miles apart.
Yes. That's that compounding effect I'm talking about.
Right.
And I believe it applies to relationships too. I think this is part of what you're doing when you're having an argument with your spouse. You're trying to work something out. Is like the example I like is similar to the airplane. You know, imagine you're in the ocean and you have two ships going parallel to one another. It only takes a fraction of a degree.
Right.
And with a little bit of time, they're miles apart.
Right.
And if you let that happen in your relationships, that's where people get in trouble. That's where all of a sudden one day, oh man, I've got 20 years of resentment because I didn't address this thing I ought to have addressed, you know?
Yeah, and they don't even realize how they've drifted apart because it was so unintentional. They were just kind of drifting. And so that's where intentionality in every aspect of our life, like you're bringing, you know, your whatever you're good at, your craft, your relationships, you know, it's very important. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe in that disciplined attitude. I grew up, my father was a Vietnam vet and a very disciplined kind of dude, and he went into the Army, ironically, to escape gang violence in the 60s in Chicago. And so he told me, he's like, I went to the military because I understood that I didn't have discipline and that I needed it. And as a kid, you know, I kind of blew all that stuff off. And as an adult, I have found that discipline shouldn't be this like dirty word, you know, that people are afraid of. Like there's a phrase I like, which is discipline equals freedom, you know, and it's really true. If you're disciplined in your craft or whatever the thing is you're doing, you're free from all of the things that might come as a result of not having been disciplined, let's say, you know, and so, yeah, I think that it's easy to perceive discipline as kind of like these shackles, you know?
Yeah.
But a lot of discipline is doing something that's difficult with a good attitude, and that teaches you a lot too. You know, my son has joined the basketball team this year, and obviously, you know, Immanuel's got a great basketball program, but it's teaching him a lot about that, about just the consistency of showing up, and not just showing up, but showing up with a good attitude. You know, anyone can show up and just kind of push themselves through something, but to show up and do something that maybe you don't necessarily feel like doing, and choosing a good attitude with it, I think that's also part of that.
Yeah.
That whole
and
thing.
in that good attitude, you'll find your role. If you're working in a group, you know, whether it's your career or a child in a basketball or a group, it's like, well, not everybody can be the Michael Jordan or the point guard or the center. And we found this with our boys here at Immanuel. Is like, yeah, they had abilities, and you know, sometimes you know you think, well, they should be on the floor over another, whatever. But then it's like, well, what do you bring uniquely to this team? You know, and for my one son, it was just to kind of keep the team loose on the bench kind of thing. And like he'd have his minutes, you know, but which were important, but it was like the other stuff that, you know, wasn't really seen on the court that was helping contribute to keeping the team loose. And like, so, I mean, there were times he just wanted to quit because he's like, oh, I'm not getting the time. I'm like, well, what are you bringing to the team other than time on the floor? And then he discovered that, and he carried that into like high school sports too.
That's wonderful, and I think learning to embrace your position as well, because it's easy to be displeased with wherever God has placed us and go, well, I think I deserve more, I should be doing more, whatever. But it's really having the humility to go, okay, this is my position, this is my role, and yeah, I was athletic. I was my father was insistent that we were involved in combat sports and stuff growing up, taekwondo, things like that. So I was athletic, but I didn't play a lot of traditional sports like my brothers did. And so when I was in high school, I went out for the lacrosse team and I got on it, but I was like third string, got like no minutes. But that was much my position on the team. I was sort of the morale guy. You know? I was like I was the loudest guy in the huddle and getting people pumped and hyped, and that's what I could do. And that's what I brought. And I found that I was more satisfied if I accepted that internally rather than struggled against it. You know, it's like that internal resistance to wherever God has placed you. It creates a lot of our misery, I think.
And you can craft those skills. Like you were talking about Jordan earlier, I started thinking about The Last Dance, the documentary ESPN.
It's a great documentary.
But when they talked about Dennis Rodman, and Rodman's talking about, he's like, I just studied rebounds and how guys shot. And then there's the whole like meme they're making fun where he's moving his hands all around. He's like, I knew if Larry Bird shot, his ball was going to go over here because of the way he shot. When Jordan missed, it was going to go here. And talk about guy finding a place, and it made him a Hall of Fame basketball player because he was just a great rebounder, which was is in a sense almost an underrated thing. But he was like, I knew when that person shot, this is where the ball is going to go.
Yeah, he was the go-to rebounds for sure. Right. I remember because my brother Jordan, he's like very athletically gifted, and my dad was a short, stocky kind of guy, and was just so. Not jealous of my brother's gifts, but really wanted him to use them for sports, and my brother just was not that interested. And so he played basketball, and my dad would always be on top of him. You need to be like Rodman going for those rebounds, And my brother would say, that's for the little guys, And my dad would say, well, Rodman's whatever, 6'6". What's your excuse, But those those shots, those full extension rebounds, and I mean, just gosh,
I would love seeing him like, full out, extension.
It's just amazing,
horizontal to the floor,
But
it just shows that like he knew his role and he crafted that skill far better than anybody in the NBA's history, in my opinion.
And I do believe that honing of something to an incredible fine point, I think that is a way of honoring God. I really do believe that, because that excellence, like you can feel that in the room, just us nostalgically sort of remembering what he did. It's like, and so that's part of my goal, to sort of tie it back to what we were talking about earlier. That's my goal with the worship team, is I just want to have a standard of excellence in that we're all working our best to be our best and bring these songs to life for the congregation. Because I think if that's the culture, it inspires people, and people just feel that they just know.
Yes,
it. Right. There's and that's another powerful thing about music, I think, is it can help attract some of the people that are really down and out. It's like, maybe someone who's really down and out shows up to church, and there's something they disagree with or don't understand in a sermon, or they might feel judged or something. But the music is one of those things where it's not you can intellectualize it, sure, but I mean, it was like this past weekend, the service was just like, I think we all felt elevated from that. There's something in music that it doesn't just appeal to the rational, logical mind, and it's not something you could intellectually argue with. If you were there, you felt it.
Right.
You know, and if you didn't, then maybe you were somewhere else in your mind. But to everyone in that room, they knew it. It's a different kind of truth. You know.
Well, yeah, I think you see that in worship when like people like will raise their hands or do whatever motions to worship. It's not like we have signs up, you know, like you see at like TV shows where like applause now, or get louder at a sporting event.
Please raise your hands.
Right. Raise, you know, get the field goal kick or hands out like this. People just naturally gravitate to how the music is moving them in that moment.
Yes, and so that's gradually, too, where I want to help sort of mentor and move the musicians to eventually is getting us in whatever practice routine we need to get to be familiar enough with the music that we can really feel like we're playing it and performing it rather than just reading from the chart, you know?
Yeah.
And listen, the chart's very helpful, but, you know, the more that I think we can feel the music up there, the more that also invites others to come join us in that, and that it's okay to move your body, and it's okay. Whatever you're feeling, you should feel empowered to act that out.
Right.
So, yeah, that's sort of what we're aiming for.
Along those aspects of, like, the crowd connecting with the musician or the band, I love watching Live Aid back in, that would have been
the 80s.
The 80s in Wembley Stadium, where Queen and that whole thing with Freddie Mercury,
the call and response,
like he's got thousands and thousands of people just like right with him, and like then the band's doing its thing and everybody's locked in. It's like as if they've been lifted off and carried into something that they weren't anticipating. So they're so there's an aspect of that I think can be certainly captured in a God-pleasing way. In our time of worship, no matter what the genre of like music it is, and it's not geared to like a performance or anything. But I always look at it like these people are like really locked into what this band is doing, what this leader is doing. And why couldn't that element of human connectedness be something captured inside of worship that pleases God, that says, I am so locked into, you know, praising God at this moment in these words or these, you know, these songs.
Look at like the Freddie Mercury thing you were talking about at Live Aid. Some of those sayings that he's saying, it's hard to... It's like gibberish, yet people are right with them.
They're right with him.
100%. It's almost like a trance-like state that people get put in. And to kind of call it back to stand-up comedy, it's that same thing. Like, I will be a little bit picky with my family if we're watching a stand-up special. I'm like, we're not starting and stopping and pausing this thing and getting up. And like, if we're going to watch it, we're going to sit and watch it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The artist intended it to be consumed that way from beginning to end. But two, if you don't consume it that way, it's hard to get into that entrained kind of trance-like thing where you're kind of hanging on every word. And you're surprised by that punchline because it's connected to everything that came before it. And so I'm not a fan of like, let's watch this for 10 minutes, pause, get up, go do something, come back. Like, no. That's not how we're going to watch stand-up in this house. That's where I put my foot down.
Foot down, yes.
And I think that ties to worship is that whole idea we're trying to create a flow in worship from that opening song to the closing song with the message, the readings, that just draws everybody in and it just takes them along on that ride.
And it's been wonderful working with you guys so far with that, and I'm excited to keep developing that because I think there's just nothing but good stuff in store for us with that. And it's all good stuff.
So I mean, it's been a great time. But
it has.
We're approaching almost 50 minutes here.
I know.
Are we really?
Yeah.
My goodness. How long do you guys usually go?
I don't know, 30
to 40.
Oh, we're breaking the record today.
So we're just, so I hate to end this conversation. Maybe we could get you back again.
Oh, sure. Anytime.
This has
Thanks
been
for
a lot
inviting me. It's been lovely. So
it's been a lot of fun and enjoyed the conversation. So, thank you, everybody, for listening, and God's blessings.
Thank you.